The rain hammered against the tent canvas like 1,000 tiny fists demanding entry. Inside, Private First Class Daniel Mercer sat on his cot, staring at the worn photograph in his trembling hands. His mother's smile looked back at him from their small front porch in Springfield, Illinois, a lifetime away from this hell in the Ardennes forest. "Hey, Mercer. You gonna sit there all night feeling sorry for yourself?" Daniel didn't look up. He recognized the voice of Sergeant William Hodge, a man whose respect he'd lost 3 days ago. It was December 18, 1944. The 28th Infantry Division had been hammered by the sudden German offensive that would come to be known as the Battle of the Bulge. 3 days earlier, during a fierce firefight near the Belgian village of Wiltz, Daniel had frozen. Not for long, maybe 10 seconds. But in combat, 10 seconds was an eternity. His squad had been pinned down by German MG-42 machine gun fire, the distinctive sound tearing through the winter air like ripping canvas. Sergeant Hodge had screamed for covering fire so they could flank the position. Daniel had raised his M1 Garand, his finger on the trigger, but his body refused to obey. He saw the muzzle flash of the enemy gun, heard the screams of his brothers in arms, and something inside him shattered. By the time he snapped out of it, Corporal James Sullivan, Sully to everyone, had taken a round through the shoulder executing the maneuver Daniel should have covered. Sully survived. But the damage to Daniel's reputation was fatal. "I asked you a question, Private." Hodge's voice was harder now, edged with contempt. Daniel finally looked up. Hodge stood in the tent entrance, water dripping from his helmet, his face a mask of barely controlled anger. "I'm fine, Sergeant," Daniel whispered. "You're fine?" Hodge stepped closer, his boots squelching in the mud. "Sully's in a field hospital with a hole in his shoulder because you couldn't pull the goddamn trigger, and you're fine?" "I didn't mean to." "I don't give a damn what you meant to do." Hodge's voice rose. "Intent doesn't matter when your brothers are dying." "You froze, Mercer. You're a coward, and now every man in this company knows it." The word hung in the air like a death sentence. "Coward." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Permission to speak, Sergeant?" "Denied." "I don't want to hear your excuses." Hodge turned to leave, then paused. "Captain Reeves wants all squad leaders at 0600. We're being reassigned to hold the line near Bastogne. Get some sleep, if you can live with yourself long enough to close your eyes." The tent flap snapped shut, leaving Daniel alone again with the rain and his shame. The next morning arrived gray and merciless. The men of Baker Company assembled in the frozen clearing, their breath forming white clouds in the bitter cold. Daniel stood at the back, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Captain Marcus Reeves, a lean man with tired eyes that had seen too much, addressed the company from atop a supply crate. "Listen up. The Germans have broken through our lines across a 50-mile front. The 101st Airborne is holding Bastogne, but they're surrounded and taking heavy casualties. Command needs every available unit to reinforce the perimeter and keep the enemy from cutting off their supply routes completely." He paused, letting the gravity sink in. "We move out in 1 hour. This is going to be tough, men. The Wehrmacht is throwing everything they have at us, panzer divisions, SS troops, the works. But we're Americans, and we don't break. We hold the line." A murmur of "Hoa" rippled through the ranks, but Daniel remained silent. As the company dispersed to prepare, Private Tommy Castellano, a kid from Brooklyn who couldn't have been more than 19, deliberately bumped Daniel's shoulder as he passed. "Watch where you're going, Yellow Belly," Tommy muttered. Daniel's hands clenched into fists, but he said nothing. What could he say? They were right. He had frozen. Only one man approached him without hostility. Private First Class Eugene Walsh, a medic from Boston with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor, sat down beside Daniel as he checked his rifle. "Don't listen to them, Danny," Eugene said quietly. "They're right, Gene." "No, they're not." Eugene's voice was firm. "Fear doesn't make you a coward. Fear is normal. Hell, I'm scared every single day out here. But you don't freeze. You run toward the gunfire to save people." Eugene smiled sadly. "That's different.
That's my job. But I've seen brave men break, Danny. It doesn't define who you are.
What you do next, that's what matters. Daniel wanted to believe him. But when he looked into the eyes of his fellow soldiers, all he saw was judgment. The convoy rolled out an hour later, 2.5 trucks bouncing over frozen roads, carrying 42 men of Baker Company toward Bastogne. Daniel sat in the back of one truck, squeezed between other soldiers who pointedly left as much space as possible between themselves and him. The countryside was a desolate winter hellscape.
Destroyed tanks and abandoned equipment littered the roadside.
In the distance, artillery rumbled like approaching thunder. Sergeant Hodge stood near the tailgate, holding onto the canvas support. His eyes swept over the men, pausing on Daniel with undisguised disappointment before moving on.
"All right, listen up," Hodge shouted over the engine noise. "When we reach the perimeter, we're being assigned to hold a crossroads 2 clicks east of Bastogne. Intelligence says a German armored column might try to punch through our sector. Our job is to delay them long enough for reinforcements to arrive." "Delay them with what?" someone called out. "Harsh language?"
A few nervous laughs rippled through the truck.
"We've got 2 bazookas, some anti-tank mines, and more guts than the Krauts have bullets," Hodge replied.
"That'll have to be enough." The laughter died. Everyone knew what he was really saying. This is going to be a meat grinder, and some of us won't be coming back. Daniel stared at his hands. They were steady now, but he knew that wouldn't last. When the shooting started, would he freeze again? Would he get more men killed? Or worse, would he run? The truck hit a pothole, jarring everyone. Captain Reeves' voice crackled over the radio in the cab. "All units, we're 10 minutes out. Stay sharp. 10 minutes until they reached the perimeter. 10 minutes until Daniel would face his demons again." He closed his eyes and thought of his mother's last words to him before he shipped out. "Come home to me, Danny. Come home, a man your father would be proud of." His father had died at Pearl Harbor. A hero. Daniel wondered if he'd inherited any of that courage, or if it had skipped a generation. The trucks rolled on through the snow, carrying 42 men toward destiny. 42 men whose lives would soon depend on the very person they called a coward. The trucks ground to a halt in a small clearing surrounded by skeletal trees. Snow fell softly now, covering the ugliness of war with a deceptive blanket of white. The men of Baker Company dismounted quickly, their boots crunching in the fresh powder. Captain Reeves gathered the squad leaders around a makeshift table, a wooden crate with a mud-stained map spread across it. Daniel stood at the periphery with the other enlisted men, close enough to hear but far enough to feel excluded. "This is our position," Reeves said, jabbing his finger at a point on the map. "Crossroads Delta 7. 2 roads intersect here, one leads directly to Bastogne, the other circles around to cut off the southern supply route. If the Germans take this intersection, they can squeeze the 101st from 2 directions." Sergeant Hodge leaned in, studying the terrain. "What's our support looking like, sir?" Reeves' jaw tightened. "Minimal. We've got 1.30 caliber machine gun, 2 bazookas with 6 rockets total, a crate of anti-tank mines, and whatever ammunition we're carrying. Air support is grounded due to weather. Artillery is allocated to the main defense lines." "So we're on our own," said Sergeant Hank Drummond, leader of 2nd Squad, a stocky man from Texas with a thick mustache. "Essentially, yes." Reeves didn't sugarcoat it. "Intelligence estimates a German probe within the next 12 hours, possibly followed by a larger push if they determine we're undermanned. Our job is to make them think twice. Make them pay for every inch." He straightened up, meeting each man's eyes. "Dig in deep, boys. And pray the weather clears so the flyboys can help us out." For the next 4 hours, the men worked like ants building a fortress. They positioned the machine gun nest overlooking the western approach, laid mines across the northern road, and dug foxholes in a semicircular defensive perimeter. The ground was frozen solid, making every shovel thrust an exercise in misery. Daniel worked alone, his foxhole positioned on the far eastern flank, the least likely avenue of attack. He understood the assignment: put the coward where he can do the least damage. As he chipped away at the frozen earth, Eugene Walsh appeared beside him with 2 canteens.
"Here," Eugene said, offering one. "Water's half frozen, but it's wet." Daniel took it gratefully. "Thanks, Gene."
Eugene jumped into the foxhole beside him and grabbed a shovel.
2 sets of hands work faster than one. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." Eugene started digging.
"But you're my friend, Danny. That doesn't change just because the others are being jackasses." They worked in silence for a while, their breath forming fog in the cold air.
Finally, Daniel spoke. "Gene, what if I freeze again? What if someone dies because of me?"
Eugene paused, leaning on his shovel.
"You know what I think?"
"I think you're so terrified of freezing that you're paralyzed by the fear of fear itself.
It's like, you're afraid of being afraid." Daniel blinked. He'd never thought of it that way.
"The thing is," Eugene continued, "courage isn't the absence of fear.
It's acting despite the fear. You think Sergeant Hodge doesn't get scared? You think Captain Reeves sleeps soundly at night? They're all terrified, Danny. They just don't let it stop them." Before Daniel could respond, a sharp whistle cut through the air. Everyone froze.
Captain Reeves stood on a small rise, binoculars pressed to his eyes, looking westward. His voice carried across the position, movement.
"Western approach. Everyone to positions, now." The camp erupted into controlled chaos.
Men grabbed their rifles and sprinted to their foxholes. The machine gun crew, Corporal Pete Kowalski and Private Luca Romano, swung their weapon toward the western road. Daniel and Eugene scrambled to their position, hearts pounding. Daniel's hands shook as he checked his rifle.
"Not now. Please, not now."
Through the snow and fading afternoon light, shapes began to materialize on the western road.
Dark figures moving in formation. "Hold your fire," Reeves commanded. "Let's identify them first."
The tension was suffocating. Daniel pressed his cheek against the cold wood of his rifle stock, trying to steady his breathing. Then Sergeant Drummond's voice boomed out, "It's friendlies."
American column. A collective exhale swept through Baker Company.
The shapes resolved into a ragged group of American soldiers, maybe 20 men, some wounded, all exhausted. They were retreating from forward positions that had been overrun.
Captain Reeves went out to meet them.
Their lieutenant, a young man with a blood-soaked bandage around his head, looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past week. "Thank God," the lieutenant gasped. "We've been falling back for 6 hours. The Germans are right behind us, a full company with armor support.
Panzer IVs, maybe Panthers. They wiped out our entire platoon." Reeves' face went pale. "How far back?" 30 minutes, maybe less. They're moving fast."
The Baker Company men exchanged worried glances.
A full German company with tank support against their 42 men with minimal anti-tank weapons?
Those were suicide odds.
Reeves made a quick decision.
"Drummond, get these men sorted out. Walking wounded stay with us, serious casualties head back in one of our trucks. Everyone else, finish those defenses double time." As the battered American soldiers integrated into their position, the reality sank in. This wasn't going to be a probe or a skirmish.
This was going to be a stand. 37 minutes later, they heard it.
The sound was unmistakable, the deep, grinding rumble of tank engines and the metallic squeal of treads on frozen ground.
Even before anyone saw them, the earth itself announced their approach. "Contacts!"
Corporal Kowalski shouted from the machine gun nest.
"Multiple vehicles and infantry."
Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs. His palms were slick with sweat despite the cold. He forced himself to look westward, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Emerging from the tree line were 3 German Panzer IV tanks, their long 75mm guns sweeping the road ahead. Behind them came 2 half-tracks packed with infantry, and behind those, at least 40 Wehrmacht soldiers advancing in combat formation. Baker Company's 42 men, now reinforced by the 18 survivors of the other platoon, making 60 total, faced over 100 Germans with armored support.
Captain Reeves' voice cut through the fear. Hold fire until they're in the kill zone. Bazooka teams, you target the lead tank on my mark. Machine gun, suppress the infantry. Riflemen, pick your targets and make every shot count.
The German column advanced with mechanical precision.
The lead panzer crept forward, its commander visible in the open hatch, scanning for threats. Daniel's finger found the trigger.
His hands were shaking badly now.
Not again. Please, not again. The tank reached the minefield. Boom!
The explosion was deafening. The lead panzer's right tread disintegrated in a shower of metal and flame.
The tank lurched to a halt, effectively blocking the road. Now! Reeves screamed. Fire! Hell erupted. The American line opened up with everything they had. The machine gun roared, tracer rounds arcing toward the German infantry.
Rifles cracked in a continuous staccato.
Private Jack Morrison stood up with the bazooka, aimed at the second tank, and fired.
The rocket streaked through the air with a hiss and slammed into the panzer's frontal armor. The explosion lit up the twilight, but the tank's armor held. The turret swung toward Morrison's position.
Morrison, get down!
Sergeant Hodge screamed. The panzer's main gun fired with a thunderous crack. The shell hit 20 feet from Morrison's foxhole, showering him with frozen dirt and shrapnel. He tumbled backward but was still moving. Daniel watched all of this as if in slow motion. His rifle was raised, pointed at the German infantry, but his finger wouldn't pull the trigger. The familiar paralysis was creeping over him like ice water in his veins.
Move! Shoot! Do something! But he couldn't.
Beside him, Eugene was firing methodically, working the bolt action of his rifle with practiced efficiency.
Danny! Snap out of it! We need you!
German infantry had dismounted from the half-tracks and were spreading out, using the disabled tank as cover. Their return fire was intense, bullets snapping through the air like angry hornets. Private Tommy Castellano took a round through the helmet. It ricocheted off, but the impact knocked him unconscious into his foxhole.
Two other men from the reinforcing platoon weren't as lucky, dropping silently and not moving again.
The second bazooka team, Privates Roy Baker and Eddie Grant, fired at the third tank. This shot was perfect, hitting the panzer in the side where the armor was thinner. The tank brewed up, flames boiling out of the hatches. The crew bailed out, rolling in the snow to extinguish their burning uniforms. But the second panzer was still operational, and it was advancing, crushing through the frozen undergrowth to flank the American position. Captain Reeves saw the danger immediately. If that tank got around their flank, it could fire down the length of their defensive line and slaughter everyone.
Hodge! We need to stop that tank.
Where's Mercer?
Sergeant Hodge looked toward Daniel's position, his face twisting with disgust and desperation.
He's useless, sir.
He's frozen again. And it was true.
Daniel sat in his foxhole, rifle unfired, staring at the chaos but unable to act. His mind screamed at his body to move, but the connection was severed.
Coward! You're going to get them all killed. Coward! Coward! The advancing panzer's turret traversed, lining up a shot at the machine gun nest where Kowalski and Romano were firing desperately at the German infantry.
Eugene shook Daniel's shoulder.
Danny, please. Kowalski and Luca are going to die if that tank fires. Something in Eugene's voice, the raw desperation, the absolute faith that Daniel could still act, cut through the paralysis. Daniel's finger twitched.
His breathing steadied. And for the first time since the incident 3 days ago, Daniel Mercer pulled the trigger. His M1 Garand barked, and a German soldier advancing with a Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon dropped.
Daniel worked the rifle's action, fired again. And again. He wasn't thinking anymore. He was just acting. Gene! Daniel shouted. Grab Morrison's bazooka. I'll cover you. Eugene's eyes widened in surprise, then he grinned fiercely. About damn time, Danny.
Eugene scrambled out of the foxhole and sprinted toward Morrison's position, keeping low. Daniel stood up, fully exposed, and laid down covering fire, his rifle bucking against his shoulder with each shot.
German bullets zipped past him, but he didn't freeze.
Eugene reached Morrison, grabbed the bazooka and the last rocket, and ran toward a position with a clear shot at the flanking Panzer.
The tank commander spotted Eugene and screamed orders.
The turret began to swing toward him.
It was going to be close. Daniel kept firing, forcing the German infantry to keep their heads down.
His rifle emptied with the distinctive ping of the ejecting clip.
He reloaded in 3 seconds, muscle memory taking over, and continued firing.
Eugene dropped to one knee, shouldered the bazooka, and sighted carefully. The Panzer's gun was almost aimed at him.
Eugene fired.
The rocket covered the 70 yards in a heartbeat and struck the Panzer on the turret ring, the junction between the turret and the hull, one of the tank's weakest points.
The explosion was catastrophic.
The turret lifted 6 inches off the hull, and flame poured from every seam. The tank ground to a halt, a dying metal beast.
A ragged cheer went up from the American line.
But the battle wasn't over. The German infantry, now without armor support, pressed their attack with desperate fury. They were committed now, retreat would mean being cut down in the open.
The firefight intensified. Baker Company's position was holding, but barely.
Men were going down, some wounded, some not moving at all. Sergeant Hodge was everywhere, directing fire, pulling wounded men to cover, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. He glanced toward Daniel's position and saw him firing steadily, calmly. Something like respect flickered across Hodge's face, but there was no time to dwell on it. The battle raged for another 20 minutes that felt like 20 hours. Then, as suddenly as it began, the German attack faltered. Their officer was down, their tanks destroyed, and American defensive fire had cut their numbers by half.
A whistle blew, the German retreat signal, and the surviving Wehrmacht soldiers began falling back, dragging their wounded with them. "Cease fire," Captain Reeves ordered. "Let them go. Conserve ammunition."
The guns fell silent, leaving only the cries of the wounded and the crackling of burning tanks.
Baker Company had held.
But the cost had been high.
8 men dead.
14 wounded, 5 of them seriously.
As medics moved among the casualties, Sergeant Hodge approached Daniel's foxhole.
Daniel was reloading his rifle with shaking hands, not from fear this time, but from adrenaline crash. Hodge stood there for a long moment, just looking at him. Finally, he spoke.
"You did good, Mercer."
Daniel looked up, surprised.
"Sergeant,
You froze at first," Hodge interrupted.
"But then you found it."
"Whatever it was you needed to find, you found it when it mattered most.
Eugene's alive because of you. Kowalski and Romano too." He held out his hand.
Daniel stared at it for a moment, then clasped it firmly.
"Thank you, Sergeant."
Hodge nodded once, then moved on to check the rest of the line. Eugene appeared, grinning despite the blood on his medic's armband from treating the wounded.
"I told you, Danny. I told you that you had it in you." Daniel wanted to smile, wanted to feel relief. But something nagged at him. He looked westward, into the darkening forest where the Germans had retreated. "Gene, they'll be back."
"This was just a probe to test our strength.
They know now that we're undermanned and low on anti-tank weapons." Eugene's smile faded. "You think they'll come again?" "I know they will.
And next time, they'll bring more tanks and more men than we can possibly stop." As if to confirm his words, the rumble of distant engines echoed through the forest, not retreating, but repositioning.
Captain Reeves heard it too.
His face was grim as he gathered his squad leaders.
The battle for Crossroads Delta 7 wasn't over. It had barely begun. Night fell over Crossroads Delta 7 like a shroud.
The temperature plummeted to well below freezing, and the men huddled in their foxholes, trying to stay warm while remaining alert. The burning wrecks of the German tanks provided some light, casting flickering shadows across the snow.
Captain Reeves moved through the position, checking on his men. He stopped at each foxhole, offering quiet words of encouragement.
When he reached Daniel's position, he crouched down beside him. Mercer, Sergeant Hodge told me what you did today.
That was solid work.
Daniel looked up, surprised.
Thank you, sir. Reeves studied him for a moment. I'm not going to lie to you, son. I don't think we're going to make it through tomorrow.
The Germans know we're here now, and they know we're weak.
They'll come at us with everything they have.
Yes, sir.
I know. But I want you to know something.
Reeves' voice was firm.
Whatever happened 3 days ago, that's over. What matters is who you are right now, in this moment. And right now, you're a soldier I'm proud to have in my company.
The captain moved on before Daniel could respond, leaving him with those words echoing in his mind. Eugene appeared a few minutes later with hot coffee, real coffee, somehow procured from the company supplies. They shared it in silence, the warmth spreading through their frozen bodies.
Gene, Daniel said finally, if things go bad tomorrow, if I don't make it. Don't talk like that. Listen to me.
Daniel's voice was urgent.
I need you to promise me something. If you survive and I don't, I want you to tell my mother that I didn't die a coward. That I was brave at the end. Can you do that?
Eugene's eyes glistened in the firelight.
You're not going to die, Danny. We're both getting out of this. Promise me, Gene.
Eugene gripped his friend's shoulder.
I promise. The attack came at dawn.
The first hint was the sound, that terrible, grinding rumble multiplied tenfold. Then, as the gray light of morning crept across the frozen landscape, they saw what was coming.
6 Panzer tanks. 4 half-tracks. And at least 200 German infantry advancing in 3 waves. It was an overwhelming force, more than 5 times what they'd faced the previous day.
The Germans had clearly decided that this crossroads was worth taking, regardless of the cost.
Jesus Christ, Sergeant Drummond whispered, staring through his binoculars.
Captain Reeves' face was pale but composed. He keyed his radio, trying one more time to reach command.
Command, this is Baker Company at Delta 7. We are facing a reinforced German assault with armor. We need immediate air support and reinforcements. Over. Static. Command, do you copy? Over. More static, then a broken transmission, Akerkamp, weather still, no air support Avila, hold your posit. The radio went dead.
They were on their own. Reeves set down the handset and turned to face his men. His voice carried across the position, clear and strong.
All right, listen up. We all know what's coming. We're outnumbered, outgunned, and nobody's riding to the rescue.
But we have one advantage, we're Americans, and we don't know how to quit. He paused, meeting each man's eyes. Every minute we hold this crossroads is another minute for the 101st to reinforce Bastogne.
Every German soldier we tie up here is one less soldier attacking our brothers.
We might not walk away from this, but by God, we'll make the Germans pay for every inch of ground.
A moment of silence, then Sergeant Hodge's voice rang out, HOH.
The cry was taken up by every man in the company, a defiant roar in the face of certain death.
Hooah! Daniel shouted it too, feeling something fierce and wild burning in his chest. Not fear this time. Something else. Something that felt like freedom. Positions. Reeves commanded. Make ready.
The German tanks advanced in a line, their infantry spread out behind them. They'd learned from yesterday, this time they were coming with overwhelming force, no probing attacks.
Hold fire, Reeves ordered. Let them get close. We need to make our ammunition count.
The tension was unbearable.
Daniel's hands were steady on his rifle.
Beside him, Eugene had traded his medical supplies for a rifle. There would be time for medicine later, if any of them survived.
The lead panzer was 50 yards away.
40 yards.
30. Fire.
The American line erupted. Rifle fire cracked across the frozen morning.
The machine gun shattered, tracer rounds reaching out for the German infantry. The last 2 bazooka rockets streaked toward the tanks.
One rocket missed, exploding harmlessly in the snow.
The other struck a Panzer's tracks, immobilizing it but not destroying it. The tank's turret rotated and fired, the shell screaming over the American position and detonating in the trees behind them. The battle descended into chaos. German infantry pressed forward, firing from behind the advancing tanks.
The American defensive line held, but men were falling. Corporal Kowalski took a bullet through the throat and collapsed over his machine gun.
Luca Romano took over, firing in short, disciplined bursts even as bullets chewed up the sandbags around him. Private Roy Baker stood up to throw a grenade and was cut down instantly by machine gun fire.
Private Eddie Grant dragged him back into the foxhole, checked for a pulse, and found none. He picked up Roy's rifle and kept fighting, tears streaming down his face. Daniel fired until his rifle ran dry, reloaded, and fired again. German soldiers were falling, but more kept coming.
It was like trying to hold back the ocean.
A German artillery shell, probably from a mortar, landed directly on Sergeant Drummond's position. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but a crater.
"Left flank," someone screamed. "They're flanking left."
A squad of German infantry had worked their way through the forest and was hitting the weakest part of the American line where Tommy Castellano, still groggy from his head wound, was positioned with only 3 other men. Captain Reeves saw the danger immediately. If the Germans broke through there, they'd roll up the entire American position from the inside.
"Hodge, take 5 men and reinforce that flank."
But Sergeant Hodge was already down, a piece of shrapnel embedded in his leg. He was trying to stand, cursing furiously, but his leg wouldn't hold weight.
The left flank was collapsing.
In that moment, Daniel saw it all with crystal clarity.
He understood what needed to happen.
He turned to Eugene.
"Gene, I need you to do something for me."
"What?"
"Take command of this position. Keep the men fighting." Eugene's eyes widened. "Danny, what are you? Remember your promise. Tell my mother I wasn't a coward."
Before Eugene could stop him, Daniel grabbed all his ammunition, stuffed his pockets with grenades, and vaulted out of the foxhole.
"Mercer!" Eugene screamed. "Get back here!"
But Daniel was already running toward the left flank, running toward the place where the line was breaking, running toward what he knew was certain death.
German bullets kicked up snow all around him.
One tugged at his sleeve. Another creased his helmet with a metallic ping.
But he kept running. He reached Tommy Castellano's position just as German soldiers were overrunning it.
Tommy was on his back, struggling with a German soldier who had him pinned.
Daniel shot the German at point-blank range, then pulled Tommy to his feet. "Fall back to the secondary position."
Daniel shouted to the 3 other defenders.
"I'll cover you." "But you'll be." "Go."
"That's an order."
They went, dragging their wounded with them. Daniel dropped into the foxhole and began firing with methodical precision. German infantry were everywhere, thinking they'd broken through. He proved them wrong. His rifle barked again and again. When it emptied, he threw a grenade. Then another. German soldiers scattered, suddenly realizing they'd walked into a kill zone with one very angry American in the center of it. But there were too many.
Daniel's rifle emptied again. As he reached for another clip, a German soldier appeared at the edge of his foxhole, rifle aimed at his chest.
Time seemed to slow.
Daniel saw the soldier's face, young, maybe younger than him, scared but determined. He saw the finger tightening on the trigger. Then Eugene Walsh slammed into the German from the side, tackling him to the ground. They struggled briefly before Eugene's knife found its mark. "I told you I wasn't letting you do this alone." Eugene gasped, dropping into the foxhole beside Daniel. "You idiot!" Daniel shouted, but he was grinning. "You beautiful idiot." "Brothers don't leave brothers," Eugene said simply. They fought side by side, 2 men against an army. Their position became a fortress of defiance. German soldiers fell back, unwilling to face the murderous fire coming from that single foxhole. But their ammunition was running out. Daniel was down to his last clip. Eugene had 3 bullets left. And the Germans were regrouping for one final push.
Jean, Daniel said quietly. When they come, run. Get back to the main line. Not a chance. Jean.
I said not a chance, Danny.
We stand together.
Daniel wanted to argue, but there was no time.
The Germans were coming. Then, cutting through the roar of battle, they heard it.
A sound like thunder, but not artillery.
Airplane engines.
Daniel looked up, and his heart leaped.
The clouds had broken.
And streaming down through the gaps came American P-47 Thunderbolts, 6 of them, their guns blazing, rockets streaming from their wings. The German armor didn't stand a chance. The P-47s made pass after pass, their .50 caliber machine guns tearing through the Panzer's thin top armor. Tanks exploded, one after another, brewing up in massive fireballs. The German infantry, suddenly without armor support and facing air attack, broke. The retreat became a rout. American soldiers cheered themselves hoarse as the Thunderbolts made one final pass, then waggled their wings in salute before climbing back toward the overcast sky. The Battle of Crossroads Delta 7 was over. The aftermath was grim. Of the original 42 men of Baker Company, only 28 were still on their feet. Another 8 were wounded but would survive. 6 had died, including Sergeant Drummond, Corporal Kowalski, and Private Roy Baker. The reinforcements from the other platoon had suffered even worse. Only 6 of their original 18 remained combat effective. But they had held. Against all odds, they had held. Captain Reeves, his face blackened with powder smoke and exhaustion, found Daniel and Eugene still in their forward foxhole. Both were too tired to move, sitting with their backs against the frozen earth. "You two," Reeves said, his voice thick with emotion, "just saved this entire company. If that flank had collapsed, the Germans would have rolled us up in minutes. Every man here is alive because of what you did." Daniel shook his head. "We were just doing our jobs, sir." "Bullshit." Reeves' profanity was uncharacteristic and therefore all the more impactful. "You ran toward the enemy when everyone else was barely holding their ground. That's not doing your job. That's heroism." He pulled out 2 Purple Hearts from his pocket, medals for wounds received in combat. Both Daniel and Eugene had taken minor wounds in the fighting. "I'm also putting both of you in for Silver Stars," Reeves continued. "And Mercer. I'm sorry for ever doubting you." "You had reason to, sir." "No." Reeves' voice was firm. "I judged you on one moment of weakness instead of seeing the strength underneath. That was my failure, not yours." 3 days later, with the weather finally clearing and supplies reaching Bastogne, Baker Company was rotated off the line for rest and refit. They'd held Crossroads Delta 7 for 60 hours against repeated German attacks, tying up an entire German regiment and preventing them from reinforcing the assault on Bastogne. The 101st Airborne, with that pressure relieved from their flank, managed to hold until Patton's Third Army broke through to relieve them. The Battle of the Bulge would rage for another month, but the German offensive was broken. Daniel sat on his cot in the rear area, finally warm and clean for the first time in a week. Eugene was beside him, his arm in a sling from a wound he'd received on the second day of fighting. A letter had arrived, forwarded from the front. Daniel's hands trembled as he opened it. "My dearest Danny, I received your letter from November. You sounded so worried, so afraid that you weren't measuring up. I want you to know something, son. Your father was a brave man, but he was also terrified every single day at Pearl Harbor. He told me that in his last letter. Courage isn't about not feeling fear. It's about choosing to act despite that fear. Whatever you're facing over there, I know you'll face it with the same courage your father had. Not because you're fearless, but because you're a good man who will do what's right when it matters most. Come home to me, Danny. But more importantly, be proud of who you are. All my love, Mom." Daniel folded the letter carefully, his vision blurred with tears. "Good news?" Eugene asked. "The best." Daniel smiled. "My mom says I'm doing okay." Sergeant Hodge appeared, limping on a cane, his leg bandaged but healing. He'd been in the field hospital but had insisted on returning to the company. Mercer, Walsh, the captain wants to see you. They followed him to the company command post, where Captain Reeves waited with papers spread across his desk.
Gentlemen, Reeves said, standing to shake their hands.
Your Silver Star nominations have been approved.
The medals will be presented next week. Additionally, Mercer, I'm promoting you to corporal.
Eugene, you're now Sergeant Walsh. We need experienced NCOs, and you've more than earned it. Daniel stared at him in shock.
Sir, I don't know what to say.
Say you'll keep being the soldier you were at Delta 7.
That's all I ask. As they left the command post, Eugene laughed a genuine, joyful sound. Sergeant Walsh.
My mother's going to lose her mind when she hears that. You deserve it, Gene.
You saved my life out there. No, Danny. Eugene's voice was serious now. You saved all our lives. When you ran to that flank, you didn't just save those 4 men.
You saved the entire position. If the line had broken there, all 42 of us from Baker Company would have died.
You understand that, right? Daniel hadn't thought of it that way, but Eugene was right.
His decision, that one moment when he chose to run toward danger instead of freezing in fear, had been the turning point. I was so scared, Gene. The whole time, I was terrified.
I know. But you did it anyway. That's what makes you brave. That evening, the surviving men of Baker Company gathered around a fire.
Someone had liberated a bottle of whiskey from somewhere, and it was being passed around. Toasts were made to the fallen Sergeant Drummond, Corporal Kowalski, Roy Baker, and the others who hadn't made it.
Tommy Castellano, his head wound bandaged but healing, raised his cup toward Daniel.
I was wrong about you, Mercer. I called you yellow, and I was dead wrong.
You're the bravest son of a bitch I've ever met, and I owe you my life. I'm sorry. Daniel raised his cup in acknowledgement. We're good, Tommy. We're all good.
Other men echoed the sentiment.
Private Jack Morrison, whose bazooka Daniel had ensured got used effectively. Privates from the reinforcing platoon who'd been saved when the line held.
Even the usually gruff Private Luca Romano, who'd taken over the machine gun after Kowalski fell, nodded his respect. Sergeant Hodge stood, leaning on his cane. I want to say something, he announced, his voice cutting through the conversation. 3 days ago, I called Daniel Mercer a coward.
I was wrong. A coward would have stayed in that foxhole. A coward would have let the flank collapse.
A coward would have let his brothers die. He turned to face Daniel directly. What you did at Delta 7 wasn't just brave. It was the kind of courage that legends are made of. You ran toward certain death to save your brothers, and you held that position against impossible odds until help arrived. Every man in this company, all 42 of us who started this fight, owes you our lives. He raised his cup. To Corporal Daniel Mercer.
The bravest man I've ever known. T.O. Corporal Mercer, the company roared.
Daniel felt tears streaming down his face, but for the first time since he'd frozen in that firefight a week ago, they weren't tears of shame. They were tears of belonging.
May 8, 1945 VE Day.
The war in Europe was over.
Germany had surrendered. Daniel Mercer and Eugene Walsh stood in a town square in Austria, surrounded by celebrating soldiers and civilians. The nightmare was finally ending.
Eugene, now a staff sergeant with 2 Purple Hearts and a Silver Star, clapped Daniel on the shoulder.
We made it, Danny. We actually made it.
Daniel, now a sergeant himself with 2 Purple Hearts, a Silver Star, and a Bronze Star earned in the fighting after the Bulge, smiled.
Yeah, we did. What are you going to do when you get home? Daniel pulled out the worn photograph of his mother.
I'm going to walk up those porch steps, hug my mom, and tell her that her son came home brave. She already knew that, Danny.
She told you in that letter. I know. But now I believe it too.
They stood in silence for a moment, watching the celebration around them, remembering all those who hadn't made it to see this day.
Sergeant Drummond. Corporal Kowalski. Roy Baker. So many others.
You know, Eugene said quietly, the guys still talk about it.
About Crossroads Delta 7. About how you saved the company. We saved the company, Gene. You and me together. Fair enough. Eugene grinned. Brothers in arms? Always.
They clinked their cups together and drank, two survivors of the storm, two men who'd faced the worst war could throw at them and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken.
Daniel thought about the young man who'd frozen in that firefight outside Wilt's.
That man felt like a stranger now, someone from another life. The journey from coward to hero hadn't been about becoming fearless. It had been about learning that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to act despite it. And in that frozen foxhole at Crossroads Delta 7, surrounded by enemies and with death certain, Daniel Mercer had made that decision. They called him a coward. But his last decision, to run toward danger when every instinct screamed to hide, to hold a position against impossible odds, to sacrifice himself so his brothers might live, the decision saved 42 men.
And made him a hero.